talking about democracy. Let's talk about disenfranchisement. Let's talk about the fact that we wouldn't have the Bush administration, not only because they stole Florida in 2000, but one of the ways they did that was by purging black people from the rolls. And all they had to do was say that these folks have felony convictions, they shouldn't be there, whether it was true or not. And because Americans are so used to the idea that black people are associated with criminality, there wasn't a big hue and cry about the fact that hundreds and thousands of people were stricken, many of whom had the right to vote. And given the slim margin of victory that Bush was able to assert, we would have had a very different outcome if we didn't do that. Not to mention the fact that we're one of the only countries in the world that disenfranchises people as a result of a criminal conviction. And if you look at the history of that, you know that it's exactly designed to suppress the votes of people of color. That's the reason that we started it. That's the reason that we continue it. Final issue on how they're the same is like the Iraq War. The war on drugs will only end when the public demands that it end and enforces that demand politically. And I have to say that it saddens me that in spite of 40 years of failure in the war on drugs, in spite of the fact that we have now become the largest imprisoning nation in the world of its own people, you don't see anywhere near the level of hue and cry about dealing with that war as you do with the war in Iraq. You don't have a move on for drugs. You don't have a group of people who are out there lobbying Congress to get rid of the policies that disproportionately affect black men. But what you do have is people applauding themselves for the fact that they're willing to vote for a black man at the same time that they're willing to continue locking up thousands. And I have to tell you, I'm a Barack Obama supporter. I'm proud to say it. But I'm also very clear that his election is not going to change the issues of institutional racism in this society unless people are willing to acknowledge the reality of that. And that's not about whether or not you like or support or are willing to live with or work with any particular people of color. It's about whether or not you're willing to acknowledge that we live in a society that puts people on particular tracks. And it does it based on race, it does it based on class, it does it based on geography. And if we're not willing to actually acknowledge that, all of the progressive candidates in the world aren't going to make a difference to really solving the problems that are plaguing this country. Now, I want to talk about some specific things that should be on the policy agenda, because I'm a policy advocate and I can't resist this opportunity to get people thinking about what actually needs to happen. So part of a federal policy agenda, eliminate the crack, powder, cocaine sentencing disparity. It is shameful and criminal that we are still locking people up 100 times longer for offenses involving crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, and that 80% plus of those federal defenders continue to be African American men, even though if you read the New York Times on Sunday, you know that there's plenty of white men who've been using crack all along. And I just want to talk about it from a practical point of view. 5 grams of crack in any city in this country is not worth $1,000. And yet, by requiring that people go to prison for 5 years for that, we're willing to spend $150,000 to prosecute somebody for a $1,000 crime. What sense does that make? We need to repeal mandatory minimum drug sentencing. The amount of time that we give to people for low-level drug crimes is criminal. In the rest of the world, 5 years is considered a sentence for a violent crime. 5 years is on the low end of what we give to people for nonviolent drug crimes. We need to repeal post-conviction sanctions that deny people access to housing, employment, public assistance, child custody, and their right to vote because they've had a drug conviction. I mean, that is so absurd that if you actually wanted people to rehabilitate themselves, that you would still continue to punish them long after they got out of prison. You have to think that that is automatic recidivism by request that we've chosen. We need to lift the federal ban on funding for needle exchange programs. I mean, more than 30 years into the AIDS epidemic, the fact that we still won't do it for political reasons is beyond criminal. Some people would say it's genocidal. particularly given the high rates of HIV/AIDS in Black and brown communities that are related to drug use right now, today. We need to forget about the zero-tolerance policies and sentencing enhancements for school zone drug activity, which never arrest people for drugs during the school day, but turn whole cities into places where you can end up getting 45 and 50 years in prison because you happen to be somewhere near a school, a child care center, or whatever. And the police deliberately arrest people in those areas so that they can give them those kind of sentences. We need to think about what we do, what we're saying when we enact those kind of laws. We need to allow the rescheduling of marijuana for both medicinal and recreational purposes. You know, I was so happy that Drummond talked about the fact that he was working on this issue more than 30 years ago, because 30 years ago we knew then that it was stupid for us to be prosecuting people for marijuana the way we do and treating it as a Schedule I offense, and yet we still keep doing it. Absurd. We need to stop giving financial incentives to the police to elevate drug law enforcement over every other criminal activity. I mean, since when does buying, using, or selling drugs become the #1 crime that police need to spend their time going after? If we're really seriously in a war on terror or terrorism, which is a whole nother issue, why would we have the police making marijuana arrests at the rate of 750,000 a year? 50,000 of which are taking place in my own city of New York, which arrests more people for marijuana possession than any other city in the world, even though we decriminalized marijuana possession 30 years ago. So go figure that one. And, not surprisingly, 85% of all those arrestees are African American or Latino men under the age of 25. Racial profiling, effective policing, I call it racism, in effect, that we've sanctioned with our dollars and our laws. Finally, I want to just talk specifically about the issue of war. What does it mean to come to things from a war paradigm? You know, we have a war against drugs and a war against poverty and a war for this or that. By doing that, we're saying that we are accepting the notion of conflict always, that that's the way in which we think that issues get resolved. I think we need to look at a society about the way in which we've structured the things that we do that have it be based on conflict. I look at this election, and it appalls me the way that we talk about winning and losing. Why can't we talk about voting as preference? Like the way that we choose our clothes, or the things that we like or don't like. It doesn't mean that jeans have won out over khaki because you chose to wear one over the other. And yet that's the way in which we talk about everything that's important in our society, as if somehow that's the measure of the way in which we do things. And I say that that paradigm is one that keeps us locked into modes of behavior that don't really work for us. That's why we call our organization Break the Chains, because we want people to break the chains of thinking and acting in ways that don't work and to actually reassess what they're doing. And the final thing I want to say is that for those of you who live in California, you have a unique opportunity this November to reassess the way in which this state deals with prisoners, people coming in. There's going to be the Nonviolent Offender Rehabilitation Act of 2008 on the ballot, put on by my colleagues at Drug Policy Alliance. It will require the state to provide services and funding for reentry, to enable people to rebuild their lives, and to limit the ways and the times in which the state can continue to keep them incarcerated. It's the first step towards ending this insanity that we call the war on drugs, and hopefully having us believe and begin to think about ways that we can have a system that supports people instead of hurting them. I believe that our basic underlying principle for all public policy is that whatever we do should not cause more harm than the issue that we're trying to address. We should never have a law in effect that hurts people more than the thing that we're supposed to be trying to protect them from. Thank you very much.